Hello everyone, welcome back to the Biggening Corporation. As it turns out, I believe this is episode 7, which is crazy to think about. We're approaching double digits of this silly little project. For those of you who do watch this live or watch for it to come out on Twitter, there are some changes in that next week I will be returning to work, so it will be a little later in the day. Starting next week, instead of 3 o'clock Central European, it will be 5 o'clock Central European, which puts it at 8 a.m. Pacific and 11 a.m. Eastern. So maybe it'll be a little more accessible to some people on the west coast of the US. Yeah, so just as a refresh to those who are joining new, a refresh and to those who are joining new, we are making an incremental game using the Business Central functionality and engine where players use bots to generate transactions and revenue and see the results, trying to compete for a season at a time to generate the most wealth. And today's goal is we are going to pick up a little bit where we left off yesterday. We now have the very basic fundamentals of a heartbeat system in place. The game has been ticking along in the background since we last left it, and our player corporation will have been listening to that. If we go look at yesterday's work where we created a power ledger entry, which we have much to do on the captioning, it would help if we were in the players test company. We're going to be doing a lot of company changes throughout all of this, so that'll be something to get used to. Power usage. We'll see that, interesting, we only had that one entry yesterday. So what's going on here? Let's go take a look at our job queue. Yeah, and we have an error. What is the error in this case? Let's find out with a little show error. And it is complaining that the record already exists. Identification values, entry equals 0. So, by not having looked at it since streaming yesterday, we don't have any lovely data here running along in our player company, but that's okay. So let's troubleshoot that very quickly. Simple enough. In the challenge of trying to talk and type at the same time, we set auto increment false. That explains the entry number equals 0. So our player side code unit was trying to insert an entry number 0 primary key over and over again, and the first time it worked, the second time it blew up. So how could we have prevented this besides paying a little more attention? For starters, it is always a warning sign if you have an auto-incrementing field inserted into the table with a value of 0, something is wrong. So, yesterday when we took a look at things and we saw the entry number was 0, that was a big giant red flag to let us know that nothing was being assigned. Auto increment starts from 1 for an integer field. So, there we are. Okay, and to my amusement yesterday, we had all the documentation warnings. There were apparently a great number of people equally surprised. Twitter was quite aglow with people who had updated their Visual Studio Code extensions and suddenly thought they had thousands of errors in their real production projects to work on. The danger and joy of always updating functionality is that sometimes things surprise you, and it's worth looking into them before you take frantic action on them. So that was fun. If we look then at our plan for today, we were going to do a dispatch manager. That sounds good, but what the heck does that mean? Okay, so in our player company, we have our heartbeat listener right now, which is triggering the event of a heartbeat, which for clarity's sake, before we build this too much, I think I'm going to go ahead and rename this function and event before we start coding too many things against it to on heartbeat. We'll see now this, again, a little tricky to see in the color scheme, but it is red because it is letting us know we are subscribed to an event that does not exist. There we go. just to be a little more clear. So the only thing listening for this event at the moment is this bot usage management that is now just slowly ticking along, potentially creating power usage. And these will pick up later to create our power wheel. But we also have the bots set up to do certain operations per day, and those operations are going to vary wildly by which type of bot. So, as you can see, which this was not on purpose, but hey, we'll take it. When we get an error by calling a code unit, the error can potentially just cause the code unit entry, the job queue entry, to stop and take no further action. And in our case here, if we had set to rerun and try, 10 times, every time it still would have failed. So this would have been permanently stuck in some sort of error state all along. Well, let's think about this. All of our bots are supposed to be ticking along doing things. There are scenarios that we are not going to properly plan for, particularly in the beginning stages of this, where some of the code we will test it out and maybe it'll produce errors, maybe it won't. Would we want a code unit to just stop because of an error and then the job queue is stuck until an administrator or a player does something about it? No, obviously not. So today we're going to do a little bit of fault-tolerant coding so that way we can correctly keep track of what is going to happen. And through that, we are going to create, as mentioned, a dispatch manager. So, what does this look like? We are going to create a new code unit. ECS bot dispatcher. We do not need a table source for this, so nice and easy. And we can steal our event subscriber for the heartbeat event. And we're going to go ahead and steal a little bit of code from that as well. But we are going to process bot operations. And we will do that also with our bot instances. Sounds good. So, now we know that we have about 8 different types of bots. Looking at the value 7 while I'm trying to say the word 8, always good. We have 8 different types of bots. We obviously don't want all of the code to be sitting in this one big giant massive code unit for all of those. And me personally, I would prefer to have not have to have every single bot type have its own job queue entry. I don't think that's of use to us. It's we want all of these operations to kind of roughly happen because at the same moment. So how are we going to handle that is we are going to through this dispatcher, we are going to go through each bot, much the same way we did for the power usage handling. Repeat. For those of you who don't know or brand new to working with AL code, we are telling Business Central we want to find a collection. This uses a SQL command behind the scenes to under the assumption that we are going to loop through this set of records. It streamlines the way that the Business Central service talks to SQL and gets records back in batches, so it's very efficient for that. Though you'll see throughout here and there we might use some of the other find functionalities. There's find first, find last, find, in which we can provide a text string to go to different places. And some of the older code you might run across will do things like find, if find first, then and do the same repeat. Functionally, both will work the same. Find set gives Business Central a hint that we are going to loop rather than just necessarily want the first record. And false in this case lets it know that we are not going to be modifying anything as a result of this loop directly. Even if we do some things that do cause the records underlying this to be modified, the actual record set that we're getting here does not need to be modified, and that'll let SQL give us the information a little more efficiently. And then, if you do not know, we are going to repeat whatever chunk of code is between the repeat until this next function returns 0. Next lets you know whether or not it has successfully moved from one record to the next. We can technically go ahead and say, skip over 10 records at a time if we were doing some sort of paging sort of logic, which is pretty rare in this development environment. The UI handles a lot of that stuff for us. Okay, sorry for the aside if you are all familiar with how all that works already, but I think it's useful. So we are going to, for each bot instance, want to run a code unit depending on which type of bot we're dealing with. My inclination is that it will be clearer to the player if we always handle the different bot operations in the same logical order every time, not necessarily which bot they created first. What do I mean by that? Well, it would make all the sense in the world to me if we ran the purchasing bots first, and then we ran the inventory basic and advanced bots second, and then we ran the assembly and manufacturing bots, and then finally some of the research and marketing, and finally the sales. Something along those lines where we do the bots in a specific order so that it is more likely that we will be able to handle all of the operations in a consistent way every time. So it becomes clear for the player to know, okay, we're gonna buy and potentially receive all of our inventory before the sales bots try to sell it. I think that will be helpful. The only unfortunate part with that strategy is that if a bot creates a purchase order for 100 of some item, and then we have a bot that receives all of that 100 for an item, and finally towards the end a sales bot sells 100 of that item, it does not get shipped till the next day when the inventory basic runs again. So, but at least then it's consistent and clear. Whereas if we just looped through the bot instance table using our instance ID, it could potentially be in what seems a little bit like random order. So I think it will be a benefit for us to do that. So let's do a couple of things. For starters, we should cycle through the bot instances with a sort of the bot types, I think. Unfortunately, this is part of the doing things as you go. It would almost be valuable if our enum was in the order of the types that we wanted to do these in operation by. Well, there's a couple different ways we can do this. Because I think that sequencing of things is pretty important to our players, and to understand the sequence of events that's going to happen, the best way I can think of is if we go ahead and create a new local procedure, handle bots of type, and we hand it off the bot instance record. Great. Okay. So what we are going to do is we are going to move this loop into our procedure, so that way we can call it multiple times. And what we will do is, as I said, I think I want the bot type of purchasing to be our first bot type. I see. Bot instance, bot type, purchasing. So if we set a filter on the bot type to only the purchasing bots, and we call our handle bots of type with this table that we've set the filter on, this is now only going to be looking at the purchasing bots the first time we call. Then we can do some of the different other types. So we can do our bot type of having a good typing day. Let's do some of our inventory friends as our next up. So what we can do is I will go through and kind of punch all of these in the different types and operations to get them all in here. And we'll play with, as we go through some of our testing, what order makes sense for them. But this allows us to give the player a consistent and expectable result set of what happens in what order. Now, within this function, just as a quick development explaining aside, there are a couple of different things going on. In the parameter, I am passing it a record. It happens to be the same variable name. This is something you'll want to be very careful of. When you mouse over it, you will see that this is local, so the scope of it is here. It would be just as easy for me to declare bot instance as a global variable for the whole code unit, and then I wouldn't need to pass the variable into this function. By setting the range here and calling it without the call, I could just have that bot instance be accessible and shared by every function. There's no difference in this particular use case for us to do it one way or the other. It's very stylistic. And in this particular case, we are also doing something by passing this with this little var modifier in front of the name of the variable. And what that means is that any changes we make to that bot instance record inside of this procedure, changing filters, things like that, will carry back out to the calling instance of this. So this effectively is making these two functions share it. In this particular case, not really a big difference, but if this procedure was not local and we called it from somewhere outside of this code unit, that would be very, very important that we pass it in this way. So I'm sort of over-engineering, but it future-proofs it for us so that we could potentially do this function call from somewhere else if we ever needed it. There's no downside, but there is complexity here in that if we wrote some code in here without thinking too hard about it, we might goof up the logic up in here. So we have to be somewhat cognizant when we use that var that we're not tripping ourselves. Okay, so if now we get our purchasing type. Okay, I'm just commenting it out so that way we're only dealing with one bot type for the moment. So we'll deal with our purchasing type first. We find a bot instance, we find our first purchasing bot, and then we do what with it? Well, here we don't know which type we're actually getting when this comes in. So we're going to do a case of bot instance bot type. As I try to remember the syntax, to work in too many languages. BCS. Oy. I feel like I'm going slightly crazy. Hang on a second. Let's see if a snippet will help me out here. Yeah, there we go. There's usually a snippet for what you're trying to do. So, case bot instance bot type of purchasing. If you haven't worked with enums or options before, you have to specify, because this is a field, you have to specify the table dot field and then the double colon syntax to access the enum or option by name. Not caption, but by name. There we go. So for the moment, we'll just have this one case scenario. It won't make sense until later when we start to have multiple cases. But let's continue on with this for now. This is still wanting some begin and else, maybe, perhaps, if we do some complex calling. I think we will. So how do we safely do some code? This code unit is what we're going to call. So how do we make this fault tolerant? The way we make this fault tolerant, if you're coming from another language, you probably think, oh, well, maybe we could do try-catch type logic. There is try-catch logic in AL code. It's relatively new-ish compared to the rest of the product, but it's mainly meant for working with external libraries, code that you are not running within the system. And the main key reason for that has to do with transactions. When we make database changes, say for example, we go ahead and we create that power ledger entry, the power usage entry, we call .insert. Well, say we then did something else with that, like posting a related table to somewhere, and an error happens. What we would want to see happen if we get an error event is we get automatic rollbacks for the entirety of the transaction, since either the beginning of our code or since the last time we manually told BC to commit, ending a write transaction. The problem with try-catch is that it does not handle rollbacks in the same way. We suddenly break that atomic thinking of the transaction flow. So when we start to do things like our purchasing bot here, where potentially we're going to create a purchase header for a purchase order, and we create some purchase lines for that purchase order, and then we go to post it. If the posting fails for some reason, and we've wrapped it up in that try-catch, well, the purchase order is going to be sitting out there. And in a normal business environment, that might not be too much of a problem, but in our game environment, the player will not have permission to interact with that purchase order. That's the bot's job, but the bot won't know anything what to do with it, so we will then be in a pretty bad shape. The way we will handle this is we are going to create a new code unit. Let's call it dispatches. Sure. Something silly like that. Doesn't really matter. It's, again, folders are for us, not for the code. So let's call this bot purchase. Yeah, that's fine. That'll work. This code unit is going to have our basic trigger of onRun. And I believe we can, if I recall correctly, we can tell it which tables should be involved. Table. Yes. Okay. I could have done this in the wizard, the previous step. I just skipped over it without really thinking too much about it. What this does, by specifying the table number on a code unit directly, is that this code unit now will expect us to hand in a bot instance record. And if we look at .rec, the current record shortcut that's used throughout the code of everything, we can see that this is recognizing that we are attached to a bot instance. So whenever we call this bot purchase code unit, we are going to have to pass it a bot instance. Well, what does that get us? It doesn't seem like it would be much. So let's look at var bot purchase, code unit, PCS bot purchase. So we've got this bot purchase we could call .run. And you'll notice that even though in the purchase code unit our run trigger doesn't have a parameter on it, the tooltip let us know that we have to pass it on a record. Well, that's not, it's not particularly earth-shattering. It works just like a procedure, it looks like, except for one thing. It returns a Boolean. Well, where in this code unit are we returning a Boolean? We're not. What that run call does is it returns true if it runs without any error. It returns false if an error happens. And that within that code unit, everything will be treated as its own atomic transaction. So within this code unit, we can create entry after entry, we can create documents left and right, we can update things, modify things, try to post things. All of that logic that sits within this code unit, it either completely works all the way through or it will be completely rolled back. And if it's completely rolled back, we'll be able to get the errors that happened. So that's a cool thing. Having worked with some other functionality, there aren't a lot of languages I've worked with that provide this much wonderful sugar for handling of different events in this way. That transactional rollback is powerful and not to be underestimated. It's gorgeous. So, now what's interesting about it is that that's entirely optional. We could just call botPurchase.run with the bot instance, and guess what? This would work until we run into an error, in which case then it would trip and it would just spit the error back out. The error handling is suppressed the minute we create some logic around the if. If we take the Boolean back from this .run, then it's on us to what do we want to do with the error messages that result from that. So this is a really useful thing to do if you're working with integrations, if you're working with automations, those sort of things. This is a very, very powerful way to capture some case scenarios. So that's useful. Okay, cool. We're not doing much with anything yet here, but I, as a player, would want to see the transactions that these different bots are doing, I would think. And from a system administrative view, I potentially would want the ability to diagnose problems that happen throughout the system, particularly from these bots taking over. Maybe there's a discount GL account missing somewhere that only happens once we get into the manufacturing process. A cost of good or a scrap percent account is not set somewhere, and we need to be able to diagnose that, or even in the future potentially handle alerts for those sort of things. So what do we do? Well, my inclination is that we go ahead and we create for the player a successful transactional history that we go ahead and log what the bots have actually done. And for our system administrator, we create an error table that we'll be able to hook into to either watch or maybe even send emails or text alerts, or we might at some point play with connecting this into a Discord server. Who knows? We could have fun with it. But we need the data. So let's go ahead and for the so we're already starting to get a lot of clutter in this bots list. So for example, the power ledger table and usage ledger, I think I'm going to go ahead and move these over into the player company folder. Whoa. There we go. From a functional point of view, that doesn't do anything massive to the way that the extension will work, compile, and anything like that. But be aware when you do move things around between folders, potentially GitHub will see these as delete and check-ins, and you may lose some of the history. I believe I saw a blog post that if you stage these changes rather than commit them directly, that the Git system can be smart enough to detect that they are the same object still and treat it as a move. I'm a little unfamiliar with that. I admit I am new to working with Git. I did my first pull request only about a week and a half ago, so I am a rookie with this. If anyone else knows, feel free to chime in at me. That's fine. So I'm going to move, since this is a player-facing table and a player-facing page, I'm going to move that into the player company and leave that in there. And we will do the same for a new table that is going to be, see, in here we're getting no object ID. Interesting. If we close everything and we do a new AL file wizard and say table, yeah, so something is a little amiss with that. That's fine, not a big deal. Bot activity. I'm losing my ability to think here. Bot activity log. We're just going to do the exact same type of thing where we do an entry number, it's a system metadata, and we'll go ahead and I'm going to shortcut this a little bit by copying the power usage log for the moment. We'll go ahead and skip over this field, and we'll bring over a lot of the same things. Bot instance, bot type, posting date. Sounds good. Great. Okay, and that makes that nice and easy. And same thing, we're going to auto increment this true. As you can see, we're going to have a lot of little tables like this. Now, for future use, I think one of the things I will do is I will have to make sure to remember, which we'll put this up into the table itself, a to-do that this should have a cleanup job somewhere. Because the bot activity log, this table will get pretty huge, and I don't think that this is a mineable source of data that will be useful. Power ledger, some of the GL transactions, all those things have analytical value. This is something that players might look at within a day or two to see just what's happening. But I don't think we'll build any data models on this. So we'll need to make sure that this is a cleanup table sometime later on. And let's go ahead and we'll give it a description field that is just going to be a descriptive chunk of what did we actually do, what was the activity. Great. Okie dokie. So there we go. We have a nice little activity log, and we'll create a new page against the bot activity log. Great. Not sure why tab doesn't work there, but it's probably a UI restriction. All right, so this is again history. It is a list part, and we'll call the table the exact same thing, and we'll pop over all of these. We don't need system ID right now. If we were going to potentially expose this page as an API page, we would want the system ID. We do not. When we do build APIs, we will build them specific. We will not just use pages. So let's keep things simple. Okie doke, and much like our power usage, this is editable false. Can't be changed. Okay, there's an activity log. Now, we had also mentioned that if things break, we need there to be something that keeps track of that. So, well, guess what? We're going to need a very similar table to this activity log, enough so that I'm going to go ahead and just copy this into a new file. We're not even going to use a wizard. And we'll go ahead and we'll call this the bot error log with the caption of bot error log. And this one is going to be data per company false. The auto increment will still work across company boundaries, but to help us a little bit out, we are also going to add a new company name, which I believe the company name field in the companies table is text 30. I'm going to make it 100 just for future proofing. A lot of fields are getting lengthened, which is a good thing, but you know, let's future proof because why not? And this is company name. Great. All right, and otherwise this is pretty similar, and we'll go ahead and error description. Great. That sounds fine. I am a little bit curious. Job queue has more interesting error handling. We may poach that to give a little bit more verbose of an error message than just a little tiny descriptive. Because right now we're going to be limited to a 200 character text message. Maybe that the object designer doesn't want to come up because I'm still got errors. This is complaining because I reused the number. Forgot to bump that. And let's save that so it renames. I love that functionality. Okay. And alright, I'm not entirely sure why that's not coming up right now, so I'm not going to worry about it. Future to-do that will want a little bit better of an error handling system besides this very basic descriptive field, but this will do for now. And now we'll do another little quick page, which is the BCS bot error log. If you are wondering, you'll notice that every single thing I'm making starts with BCS. I'm obviously not going to be putting this into AppSource. For one, if I were to want to put this into AppSource, I would have to have applied to Microsoft and asked for a prefix. They give out 3-character prefix codes for all their various objects that go into AppSource. You can request one specific if it makes sense for your company. But I think it's a good habit, and it also massively helps out with the IntelliSense. We always know exactly which are ours for this extension, so strongly recommended you just have the habit. Okay, and we'll do all of this, and again, we don't need our system ID. Great. I like some of the different designs. Entry number, primary key type things go way off to the right, some goes way off to the left. For our case here, where it's an incrementing thing, way off to the left feels fine because that's our primary key. Might as well have that there. And we'll put company name towards the beginning as well, so we know, so we can more easily see which companies are troublemakers. And as before, this is editable false. Okay, so now we've just very rapidly spun up a couple of logging tables where we can put some information and we can decide how do we want to handle that. So in this case, we have a bot code unit that we are treating as a variable. It is a good idea because it is a variable to make sure to reset code units with a clear typing and explaining at the same time, do silly things. If we clear the code unit, this ensures that each time we call .run, that this is an entirely new version of this code unit, that any global variables, local variables, all that, they're all completely wiped out and reset. That lets us tidy things up. So in our case here, if the code unit runs successfully, yay, it worked. Fantastic. So what we will do then is we will want to log to the player. What do we got? Activity log. Thank you. Which I cannot type today. Fantastic. So we'll log it to the log. Brilliant. All right. If something did not work about it, did any sort of error whatsoever, then we will go ahead and log to the system error log. Okay, so now we're going to want a couple of different things. If it worked successfully, we want to create that player activity log, but I threw in a little curveball on myself here in that I put a description that, we want to describe in some meaningful way what actually happened. For a purchaser bot, that might be created 3 purchase orders. It might be something along those lines. For an inventory bot, it might be posted 20 warehouse orders. I don't know, it could be any number of things. How do we get that information? Well, the best bet in our case in this purchase code unit is we will create a variable of result text, which our description was, come on brain, activity log table, there we go. Description 200 will make the description, the result text up to 200 as well. Okay, well, we still have no way of accessing that. We're not setting it. Well, for accessing it, nice and easy, get result text, which will return text 200, and that will return or exit result text. Great. Now out here in the dispatcher, we will be able to access that instance of the code unit to get the result text back out because things worked. So that's cool. Excellent. So let's go ahead, and we now know we need some variables up here for the bot act log. I'm going to truncate that because I'm just having a dickens of a time typing activity over and over again there. BCS bot activity log and bot error log, just so they're visually a little consistent. There are some naming guidelines and recommendations about how you name variables and how you decide to shorten variables. It is a good idea to review the docs website from Microsoft for that, that talks about some of the naming guidelines. For example, it is perfectly reasonable for temporary little variables like a integer loop or something to use the single character type things, but they would frown upon going crazy with like BAL as our bot error log, and some of the older styles that are preferences for people, it can be beneficial to preface some of your variables. Like I know some people like to do L bot activity log so they can always quickly see that this is designed to be local versus a global of the same name. And some people will put global G before it. They'll put P bot instance for parameter, for one of the parameters up here. Some people will underscore those, and there's a lot of different styles. It's worth reviewing some of the Microsoft guidelines on that, and you're just going to see some of the habits in the wild as you work with additional developers out there. Me, in the Business Central world, I personally don't do any of the prefacing simply because of the fact that we get the mouse over tooltip to let us know parameter, local. So it becomes easier to not accidentally goof up and see the different variables. So for example, global here, if I had done something bonkers and created a variable that was local of the same name, here it assumes that I'm going to be dealing with the local variable, even though there is a global of the same name. It will not warn you, it will not throw any errors at you that you are reusing it. In this scenario, this will always return blank, and later we would wonder why. Well, if you come in here and you look at things, you see this is using the local. If you do find yourself in that situation, one of the delightful things I love about Visual Studio Code, we can rename a symbol. So, whoop, local result. Whoop, there we go. And now it's changed it throughout that function. So, very, very handy. We'll go ahead and roll all this back. Sorry for the aside, but I think there's good topics in there. So this code unit, we have the ability to return some result text now. That's great. We have our log variables. So now let's create it. Activity log init and if you are working with existing code, existing coders, one of the things that is currently in the solution has been in the solution for a very long time, but is currently being phased out of the solution is an ability to say with. I wanted to bring it up because you will see code still doing it here and there. By saying with bot activity log do and then whatever code is going to follow, here now we can assume that that's the same as typing bot activity log dot. It makes that part implied. So now if we look, we can see we start to type entry number. Well, where is it getting that from? It's because it's coming from the bot activity log. You will see lots of existing code with this as this is being phased out. It is being phased out because it was creating some clarity issues. It is very easy to accidentally start nesting with, so when you get into complicated code, and that was creating some real problems for code testing. So I figured I would bring it up because you will see it and wonder, well, why, if we can do that, why am I setting all of these different fields manually in this way? So that's why. Bot instance, bot type. We could theoretically poach some of this same logic from the power ledger since we're doing the same general idea. Instance ID, bot activity log. Our posting date is always our work date. We are always going to be using work date because we still have to put some logic in place to change the work date. Okay. Now, and finally, last but not least, the description equals the bot instance dot get. Now I feel a little bit crazy. Oh, right. It's not our bot instance, it is our code unit, our bot purchase code unit, get result text. There we go. Bot activity log dot insert and true as usual because there's no reason for us not to. Great. So now every time we run this dispatcher code unit, it is going to march through all of our bots. It is going to find a purchasing bot type, and for all of the purchasing bots, we will call this function, which will loop through all of the purchasing bots. Well, it'll loop through all the bots that match the filter. In this particular case, all of the filters are all the bots will be filtered to purchasing, and when we fall into this case logic, we will go down that purchasing branch, which will use the purchase BCS bot purchase code unit, and it will attempt to run whatever code is in there. If it works, it will create entries in the event log that the player can see, and it will note exactly when that happened, and it will potentially do any sort of resulting text that we specify inside of this code unit. Now, if it fails for some reason, we're going to cheat a little bit here. Coding trick for you. I want this chunk of code. I want all of these to be against the error log instead of the activity log. So copy and paste that, throw that into Notepad, replace the bot act log with bot error log, replace all, copy it, close it, I don't need it, and there we are. Now we have high speed, just redone that whole handling. And in our bot error log, let's see here, we called that, just making sure I have the field. I should have changed this in the bot error log to be the error message. Always a good idea not to name your fields directly the same thing as a function reserve word type thing, so I am not calling it the error. Someone mentioning in chat that rename symbol will do that as well. The only reason I didn't do that is because I didn't want to change this batch up here. I don't know if we can selectively say I would like to rename just these 6 lines. Maybe so, maybe not. If so, that'll save me some time, so that'll be interesting to find out. So yeah, let's get that updated here, error message. Now that we save that, it tells us that this is no longer a correct line, which is true. So, error message, and now we can do something kind of neat. We can get last error text. If I am recalling my sequence of how this all plays correctly. So, just double checking, I believe that's the way I want it to work. Now, the thing that we have to watch out for here is get last error text returns a text, but you'll notice that this returns a text with no size constraints. This could be, thousands of characters long. It could be a pretty significant stack trace, but we can't quite do the same thing at the field level yet. We could potentially do a blob type field where we receive the full error message, but I'm not going to do that just yet. That takes a lot more steps than simply assigning the text to it. So how do we deal with the fact that it is possible we will get 201 characters, and when that assignment happens, this will create its own error just trying to create the error. We will truncate that, and to do that we will just do a copy string 1 to the max string length of our bot error log dot error message. So this will take whatever the result of this function is, and it will go from 1 to the length of this field. If we somewhere along the way decide to bump this up to 250, which is the current, as of this recording, maximum size of that text field, we don't have to recode that. It'll just automatically adapt that. So in our to-do list, maybe we want to handle the whole error result with a blob. So, okay. All right, fantastic. Yeah, so now we have some way or another that the purchasing bots will attempt to do things, and if something goes wrong, our error log page, understandably wondering where did description go. We renamed it, so let's fix that. Okay, perfect. And now our bot for the purchasing code unit doesn't actually do anything. So we should probably handle that. In this case, we are not quite ready today to go ahead in the next 6 minutes create the logic of generating the purchase order lines and a posting routine to go with it. Unfortunately, as quick as I can code, even if I shut up and just focused, I don't think I could quite do that in 6 minutes. But what we can do for now is we can say that the result text is equal to, and we're going to use a little function here called string subst number, which it does that substitution trick where we replace the %1 with the values of things. We will go ahead and say, in the future, I would make %1 purchases. Sounds good. And our %1 will be replaced with our rec.operations per day, which will eventually be a calculated field to take into account research technologies and all that sort of thing. But for now, we'll just pull it right off the table itself. Okay, so we now have a dispatcher that will iterate through our different bot types. At the moment, it's restricted to purchasing, and it will potentially safely call with logging to 2 different potential destinations, a code unit that will simply spit back how many purchases that it would make. Fantastic. That's pretty good so far. So let's go ahead and publish that. We've done a lot of coding without sending anything over to Business Central. So let's get that over. First publish of the day always makes it think a little harder. Da-da-da-da. Ooh. So, I had goofed up because of the fact that the entry number field was incorrectly labeled false and I updated it to true. It is complaining that we cannot change the auto increment of fields. And that's true. We can't actually. That 0 value is not technically valid. So I believe we can override that with something here. In the schema update mode of our launch.json, we can do a few different things. Normally it's synchronize is the default status. This will try to preserve as much data as humanly possible. Well, not humanly. It'll try to preserve as much data as possible. There's a great way to look at the list of what things can and can't be preserved. The key phrase on that one will be destructive changes. In our case, we are going to bump this over from synchronize to force sync. One of the options that I don't use very often, but you can do, especially early in development, if you do schema update mode recreate, I believe that clears all of your custom tables out entirely and regenerates them from scratch. Really handy if you're early in the development cycle and you potentially have bad test data that accumulates over time. When you publish your next change, boop, all gone. In my case, I will do a force sync. What this will do, if I am remembering correctly that this will work, because that entry number field is changing in a way that you cannot synchronize, I believe it will delete all the records in our power ledger. Let's find out. Force sync is pretty fun, but it's also interestingly dangerous. I have seen during an upgrade process general ledgers and customer tables and all sorts of other things just poof, disappear. So if you're playing with force sync and it's something that has any data you care about, take a backup, take another backup, put the third backup on a USB stick and put it on the desk next to you. You will want it. But in our case, we're just playing around, so we're fine. All right, now if we refresh and we look at our power usage ledger, nice, interesting. So that was not technically a destructive change, so it didn't delete that entry. That's neat. Cool. All right, let's go to our job queue. And now I feel like I'm going slightly crazy. Refresh. What just happened there? Okay. All right, so we will go ahead and set our status on this heartbeat back to ready. And we are going to make a new code unit job queue entry for our dispatcher, and that's the only one we need to create anything for. The rest will be called automatically from this code unit. So dispatcher, and just like the power entry one, we are going to set this to run every 1 minute because there is no harm. It will only run on the relevant heartbeat situation. So start at midnight. Okay, and it is going to be every minute. Sounds good. And we will set the status to ready. All right. Now, just to keep things marching along, we are going to hop over to our master data company. Into our job queue. Now, this is interesting. We have an error as of a few minutes ago on our master heartbeat. What's the trouble? If we look at the show error, we tried to invoke a code unit object with ID 8002, and that object ID does not exist. Well, if we take a look, obviously that object ID does exist. The job queue happened to run while we were in the midst of publishing from Visual Studio Code. And the result of that was that it just managed to catch the perfect time where technically this object didn't exist anymore. So we'll go ahead and restart. Set you to ready. And if we look at that, then it is going to run as of a minute ago. Great. And if we look at our log entries for that, by the time we look at our log entry for that, it will have already run because it is a tiny little job. So, perfect. And now we know that this job has run. We should be able to go over into our player data company, and we should see that the heart is beating away over in here. Fantastic. This is set to run every minute, and if we look at the log entries of this, we should see that that should tick over in just a moment. Let's go look at our power usage, and here we go. There is the entry that just got created now, entry 1 from our bot instance 2, a sales bot, and it was a usage of 10. Now, that's all well and good, but unfortunately at the moment we don't have any purchaser bots. So I'm going to try real quick, because we are at an hour, to create a quick bot template. Nothing fancy here for our Robo Buyer 1. Sure. Base price of 10. We'll say 2. There we go. Okay, and now in our bot instances, I believe in our bot list we did not add any functionality to create the purchasing bot via our wizard, so we're going to just manually cheat this in. And this is going to use 25 powers per day, and this one is double the usual bot. Just because I want to see that when the heartbeat goes through, that the operations per day should tell us in the event log that it is 4. So to make sure that this kicks off before our log is done, before our live stream is done for the day, let's go over to our master company, and we will go to our game setup. And here in the master company, we will manually bump this up. Now in our player company, we can switch back. You'll see there are some ideas out there asking, by idea I mean on the Microsoft Ideas website, asking for a faster way to change between companies. I admit I would love that right now, because that's a little bit of a digging for me. Okay, so now we've got a routine ticking along that should be due any moment now to go ahead and run for our 404. No joke intended. Our 404 time. We should in a moment see a purchase bot come into this usage table, and we should also be able to look at our bot activity log and get a result. Let's see. I didn't leave myself much time for troubleshooting, so hopefully this works. And we have an error on the heartbeat listener. What is our error? I keep wanting that to show me the job. The record in the BCS Power Ledger already exists. What could that be all about? Well, that should never happen, right? Because we're auto-incrementing, right? Well, guess what? We're we have a fun little quirk to this that I have not told you about, because I was hoping we would have had that to look at the beginning of our session here. So we have our power usage management code unit that is creating an entry, and it's inserting it. And that obviously worked, right? We had entry 1, we had entry 2. What could possibly be failing? The problem here is that we are looping through bot instances, and for the first time ever, we have 2 possible bots. The first time we come through, this was creating entry number 3, and then the second time through, this init did not clear out the entry number. So it still had .entry number equals 3 when it tried to insert this as a new record. So if we really want to handle things correctly with all of these auto-incrementing, we could manually set them to 0, or we can clear the variable. There are a few different ways we can do this. There are some pretty decent reasons for manually handling your own auto increments, but this should do our trick. And we are also going to copy that over into our dispatcher, because I was wondering which table we'd get that error on first so I could show you this. So we will want to make sure we clear the bot activity log and clear the bot error log. There we go. So that way they are a nice, clean, new version of that variable each and every time. And I believe those were our only auto-incrementers that we had to worry about for today's testing. So let's publish that. On the bright side, we should be able to go ahead and tell our player heartbeat to start over, and it will have the new version and run immediately. So, status to ready. And if we look at our log, we see that it has an error from the previous attempt to run, and we still have an error. Interesting. What's our error this time? Interesting. Okay. Whew. That could potentially be a problem. We may have to spend a little more time sorting out the exact nature of how to handle this, because, I swear that used to pop open the full error text. So this is telling us that cal functions are limited during write transactions because tables are going to be locked, and code unit.run is allowed in write transactions only if the return value is not used for. So I may have written our dispatcher a little bit wrong. Going to have to think about that for a moment. Alright, well, I guess Episode 7, ending on a cliffhanger. Will our dispatcher be able to cope properly with code unit calls in a safe error return handling sort of way? I guess we'll find out tomorrow because I am out of time, but we will definitely solve this little riddle, and it's probably something simple, but unfortunately, time is up for today. So, thank you for tuning in for today's episode, and hopefully most of it will still be of value tomorrow, but sometimes development is a little bit of a dead-end sort of thing. We try a thing we think will work, and then we sometimes have to back out of it a little bit. That may be the case with this today, and I guess we'll find out tomorrow as we rejoin. Just as a recap and reminder, for those of you who enjoy tuning in live, I will be changing the schedule next week, 2 hours later. It will be at 5 p.m. Central European Time instead of 3 p.m. So, tomorrow I will see you at 3. Take care, everyone.